The Hunter's Moon. I often wonder what the hell these people are thinking. In between the endless words that spill out of their mouths, is there anything behind their eyes, anything real? All of it seems so automated. He thought to himself as he observed the crowds from a distance. The city is growing cooler with autumn, and the days getting shorter. Shadows stretch long and tall, beyond every one of them. They wander about without purpose like mindless insects, but amongst them she emerges as the parting of a sea. She is like a wildflower blooming in the depth of a desert. Her chestnut hair flowed gently on the breeze. He inhaled as she passed, and he could pick up notes of lavender. She had a confidence in her stride, both sexy and proud. Her eyes were pale blue, and her legs were strong. She wore a simple dress, traditional, but it complimented her toned figure nonetheless. He followed, as he had several times before, always keeping her lovely frame at arm's reach. She sparked something in him, a fire. She had no idea, and that was the biggest rush, warming his blood, which pumped through his veins ever more furiously. He wanted her to be his, all of her, but not quite yet. I have to hang back. I have to simply observe, and not be noticed, he thought to himself. She continues on, stopping momentarily to admire an outfit, and she is unlike any of these drones moving around her. He can smell the life coming out of her every pore. A pheromone? He was helpless against its pull, so helpless in fact that he almost gave up his cover by literally bumping into her. This would not be good. He wasn't ready. As the afternoon sun slowly crossed its highest point in the sky, she walked into the local bar and grill for a bite to eat. It was her favorite place. People are such creatures of habit. Follow someone long enough, and a pattern will emerge sooner or later. It doesn't matter how much fire or allure someone has, there is always a pattern. Part of the game he loved to play was figuring that out. It was intoxicating, and maybe his favorite. He sat down at the bar and ordered a whiskey. Neat, perched on his stool, he was able to overlook the entire dining area, which lay before him. She was seated at one of her favorite tables, which sat too, although she is yet to dine with another under his watch. The waiter crossed over and took her order with an unusual wide smile. He wondered if he should do the same, food or just nurse a drink or two. She would likely be getting a steak, rare, with a baked potato. She would probably pair it with a glass of chilled white wine. The pub was sparsely filled, a mix of professionals and blue-collar males, all of whom enjoying an extended lunch. There were a few older people, retirees, that have already had one too many for such an early hour. It was also too early for any sports, so the few televisions that were on were tuned to the news channels, but without sound. There was a jukebox playing an assortment of music. He noticed a crawler at the bottom of one of the screens, which read, "The public is uneasy with the looming full moon." Federal and local law enforcement were now coordinating their efforts to apprehend the killer, whom they now dubbed the Full Moon Killer. They urge all women fitting the profile to travel in pairs or groups during this time, especially if they were traveling at night. He couldn't help but smile as he looked away from the television to find she had received her wine and was enjoying a sip. They are such creatures of habit. Some of the men, who were scattered around her, would look over at her. She paid no mind, but he could tell she noticed every look and could barely contain a smile of her own. It seemed she had this effect on every man. He was good at his craft, which is why he remained on the fringes of her world. Although he had been following her for almost a month, this was the first time he allowed her to actually see him. His face was a new face amongst her ever-changing cast of characters, moving in and out of her life. So if she caught his gaze to receive his smile, it was okay, whether she seemingly accepted it or not. It wouldn't be long now. The waiter delivered her steak, which was bloody. The red juice ran out of every cut she made, and it was slowly filling the bottom of her plate, saturating her baked potato. A masculine meal, he thought, for such a sexy and unassuming woman. Looking back up at the television, the crawler was no longer about him. It was something about an animal attack a couple of months ago. He paid little attention, but he remembered hearing about an escaped zoo animal and some unlucky bastard who got in its way. There was finally a good song playing on the jukebox, and his mind wandered. He was finishing up his second whiskey as the waiter was bringing her the receipt. She was returning her card to her wallet and gathering herself as he looked on. He was curious if she would look at him again. He felt confident she would, so when she stood and glanced over at him, his smile was of sincere gratitude, and she was out the door, but he did not pursue her. There was no need. He knew where she was going. He gathered up the singles from the bar and stuffed them in his pocket. He walked out into the coolness of the afternoon. He always enjoyed the feeling of a cool breeze on his face after a couple of drinks. It was different, refreshing in a new kind of way. He made his way to his car, which was parked several blocks away, in front of a little pizzeria. He opened his trunk after a glance around his immediate area to take a last inventory of supplies. He would enjoy a quick slice of pizza to soak up the alcohol before getting into his car for the long drive to the country, where the final game awaited him. On the road toward her house in the country, he reflected on his past ventures, his former playmates. He's had many in the past 5 years. Although he spent much longer just thinking about how he would do it, he can remember sharing a playground with school friends and thinking about it. The many incarnations these scenarios would take. He can remember his first taste of death, how he held the rodent in his young hands. It was a perfect day, not unlike this one. He was alone in a park, a very secluded area. He had found himself here after discreetly slipping his best pal's pet mouse into his book bag. Now that he was alone, he carefully took his playmate out of the bag and studied it. It was a white mouse with blood-red eyes. It was gentle and disease-free. He was sure of this because it was a pet. The waning sunlight reached them through the branches of the trees that surrounded them. He looked at the mouse for a long while, not thinking, just looking at it. He could feel a little heartbeat in his palms, and he seemingly slipped into a trance. He did not know how long they shared this moment before he began to squeeze. The sound it made was barely audible, but he could feel its heartbeat slow, and then it was gone. He never felt so in control, so alive. He was intoxicated before he even knew the word. There were no words in his vocabulary that could capture this feeling of elation. In fact, if truth be told, there still wasn't. At least no word he could ever think of that could truly encompass it. And as the years went on, his playmate slowly grew bigger, and so had the thrills along with it. He was 25 when he stalked his first human playmate. She was beautiful. She had shoulder-length auburn hair. She was curvy, salacious, and seemed like a proper first friend. He was not disappointed. He spent months following her around before finally getting up enough nerve to grab her. They played their game in an abandoned garage a few miles outside of the city. She was gagged and securely bound to a chair. He had dressed her into some appropriate attire for the occasion and spent hours with her. He ran his fingers through her hair and ran them up and down every inch of her skin. He admired and loved her, loved every moment of their time together. And as he felt her life slowly slip through his fingers, which were wrapped tightly around her neck, he felt a high that he was resolved to chase for the rest of his life. After he laid her lifeless body amongst the tall trees with care, he glanced up and saw the moon. It was full and bright, and everything was perfect in that moment. It was a hunter's moon, and he would be sure that this would be the backdrop for all of his playmates that would follow. The exit seemed to have come quicker, and it broke him out of his reverie. It was time to focus on the playmate at hand. She deserved the very best he had to offer. Although he has had many over the years, he could feel that she was somehow different. He wasn't sure how, and now he pondered this. He did not lack feelings towards certain people, no matter how few in number they were. What he lacked was empathy, but he wondered if he was starting to have feelings for her. No, that was stupid. It was something else. He will allow the game to play out. Whatever was to happen will simply unfold. He was very confident in his ability to adapt to any situation. These were his thoughts as he pulled his car off the paved road and found his way onto the dirt and gravel. When he was satisfied that the car was far enough away from the road, he killed the engine. He sat for a moment and was at peace. The remaining sunlight was starting to dip below the trees in a beautiful autumn gloaming. It wouldn't be long now. He opened the trunk, threw the hiking bag around his shoulders, and started out toward her house on foot. He has done this hike enough times to know every inch of the path. It would be dark by the time he reached her. His plan was to keep a distance and remain in the cover of the woods. There was a nice tree he would climb, which gave him the perfect view through many of her windows. He would then wait until he felt the time was right to begin. The time always varied amongst all of his playmates, but he always knew when, every time. She was already in her robe, her hair was wet. She took her shower already. This was her custom after her long drive into the country. As she crossed from one room into another, then another, and another still, he could barely contain his excitement. Was it that pull he always felt when he was in her presence? He wasn't sure, but he knew he wasn't going to fight it long. He wanted to bring the game to its climax. He wanted her. And there it was. He started toward the house in the cover of night, but a sound stopped him in his tracks, and he dropped to the ground. He heard the sound of a sliding door closing, the back of the house. He stayed where he was when he noticed she was walking across her backyard. She slowly disappeared within the trees that lined her property. He got up and started toward her as quiet and as carefully as he could. This was different and exciting. Where was she going in the dark? He had no answers, so he continued to follow. He heard the cracking of branches and broken leaves, which he thought surely were from under her feet. He stopped to get a sense of his surroundings, but the moon was not high enough to help. He continued on and saw what looked like a clearing ahead. And then he saw her. She stood there as he crept closer toward the edge of the tree line. There was a strike of a match, and quickly the large collection of gathered tree limbs became a bonfire. He was taken aback by this sudden change of events, and felt a panic rise up within him. He quickly regained control of himself, and thought to stay put. He felt his playmate was different from the very beginning of the game, so this should not have surprised him, but it did. With the light of the fire, he could see she was still in her robe. She was also barefoot. She was walking about the bonfire, her feet digging into the grass as she crossed the front of the flames. He was slack-jawed as she called out to him. This was certainly unanticipated. "I know you're there," she said with complete serenity. "You can come out now. I promise I won't bite." Her voice was perfectly at ease. He reluctantly stepped out from the protective blanket of trees. Even in this situation, he felt he still had the upper hand. He had his bag of tricks with him. He was the dominant sex. He had the plan and the years of experience. But he couldn't help but wonder if all of his experience was the wrong kind of experience. She turned to face him. "I was wondering if you were going to come out of there," she said. He stood there silently. She slowly pulled her lips into a smile, which was an ominous sight as the flames played upon her face. She looked almost evil, and he said nothing. He just stood there. "I know who you are," she said. "I know you've been following me. It's been how long? 2 weeks? 3? I don't know. I've lost track myself. I can get pretty busy. Well, you know," she said with a hint of sarcasm in her voice. "You look pretty stunned over there. Lost for words?" Still, he said nothing. "Well, I'll continue to do the talking. That is, until you feel you want to add something. You're more than welcome to. Anyway," she continued, "I stumbled upon your last playground, purely by accident. She was already badly decomposed, but I knew it was your work. I found her a few days before the police. I'm pretty resourceful. You may not have noticed that about me. I always knew when you were around, and when you were, I played the unsuspecting weaker sex. You're very good at what you do, I'll give you that, but sooner or later, all of this was bound to end. I mean, you knew that, right?" she asked. "I don't understand," he said, finally breaking his silence. "You wouldn't," she said, "but maybe you will. You have taken many lives, all for sport. I wonder how many women. Did you bother to keep count? All of these women had lives outside of your pathetic little world, your little game. They all had families, people who loved them, and you took them. You took them away from everyone they knew." "How?" he asked in monotone. "How what?" "How did you know who I was? I told you, I'm resourceful." "I heard that," he said, "but how? You said you found my last friend, but how? From there? How did you connect it to me?" She visibly broke away from the conversation and looked up at the night sky. He was still cemented into the ground on which he stood. He was far too confused to do anything but. In fact, he completely forgot about the bag of toys he wore on his back. "The big bad full moon killer," she said. There was no emotion in her voice, and it carried a very chilling tone. She locked eyes with him. Her pale blue eyes were bright in the firelight. She started to undo her robe, opened it, exposing her naked beauty. Even now he still found her irresistible. Her body was young and perfect. She let the robe fall to her feet. "You have a smell, a stench really. It comes off of you always." She mockingly sniffed the air. All I had to do was follow it. "I don't understand," he said. "I said you wouldn't, but maybe." She looked up at the sky to see the full moon being unveiled by the clouds. "You will." He stood utterly transfixed at her nakedness, as if it were the first time he had ever seen nakedness. But his eyes began to play tricks with his mind. He could see muscle in her legs and abdomen begin to contract. He could see hair sprouting and thickening all around her. Her eyes became as blue as ice, and her face began to protrude to an unnatural length. The hair almost covered her now looming and hulking frame, the sounds escaping her both agonizing and terrifying. This was not real. Couldn't be. Was he unconscious somewhere? Was he dead? No, he realized he was very much alive, and standing before a beast that could only be called a wolf. He made a break for the woods, hoping that it wouldn't pursue him. The car was somewhere nearer to the road than where he was. Maybe he could find the house and barricade the door. His thoughts were nonsensically fragmented as they fired through his mind. He was crashing through the woods and making enough noise to wake the dead. He stopped and looked around, but he couldn't tell which way would take him to the house. It was then that she pounced. She was on top of him and tearing at his throat, ripping flesh, blood spraying everywhere. He died where he lay, his eyes wide open. She made a feast of his upper torso, digging into him with such fury as if not to leave a morsel for any other carnivore. She ate from his corpse until she felt satisfied and threw her head back to let out a blood-curdling howl toward the hunter's moon. Her call echoed through the valley, announcing her dominance to every creature for miles. People stirred within their homes, each feeling a cold chill run up their spines. And on her porch, a mother stands up to peer out into the woods that began just beyond her backyard. Her mind was full of thoughts and memories of her brother all evening. It has been several months since his abrupt departure. There was nothing more to see or think this evening. Catalina turned and walked into her house and turned off the light.